Hi, my name is Dominique Lester. I am really excited to be here today, or wherever day, morning, evening you are watching this recording. And I'm very excited to join with other archivists in the conversation coming along around real things that are affecting real archivists in our day to day work. And I will admit that I personally like to talk about real things in the form of a story. It's just a little easier for me. So if it's okay, I would love to dive into the story of Archivia Land. I know it's really original, I made it up, but I would love to dive into a conversation around this place thing called Archivia Land and the people there, right? Like the people there are some of the coolest, most authentic, most inspirational people that I personally have ever met. And they're kind of like superheroes. Like the place itself is kind of like this hidden treasure trove from all different times throughout history, and the people who live in archive land are just so they care so much about the world. They're always striving to make the world a better place. But admittedly, kind of like all civilizations, just like a place has its abundances, it also has its unique challenges and drawbacks. And archivists and archive land often struggle with kind of a lot of the same things that other people struggle with, such as, being overworked and overcommitted and stressed out and haven't had a vacation, right? And honestly, could we even afford a vacation if we wanted to, right? But on top of all of that, like archive land is this place that's just like very much open to visitors and guests, but it can often be viewed or has been viewed as this kind of like elite place, as this elite space where some don't feel like they belong. And this is often very confusing or mysterious to a lot of archivists or the people of archive land, because, if you knew what they knew, like you would understand, like you would already know that archives are notoriously underfunded and always competing for priority and have backlogs as long as my arm, and typically, have collections that support the voices of us, the same group of people that we already often know a lot about. And so they can get kind of confused because it all of these things lead to some people or some visitors, loving us, and then others not knowing that we exist, or even worse, not trusting us. And so, by the virtual raise of hands, I would say, like, is it me? Am I off my rocker? Would you agree with these points? Would you agree that these kinds of things add up to the story of the archives profession? And do you believe, or would you agree that you and I, and that everyone here kind of contributes collectively to the writing of this story? Or is it something that is just kind of this passive turning of time, the end result of a chronology of events, right? But before we answer those questions, back to the story, so like we have this place and we have these people, this profession, and all along there's this dragon, right? There's this dragon, or this adversary that's kind of always sly and unassuming, like quietly slurping around, and it tends to gobble up, let's say. It tends to gobble up a lot of its favorite foods. Like this is how the dragon is fed, through things like burnout. It's fed through recruitment and retention issues. It's fed through non-competitive salaries. It's fed through a lack of upward mobility or a lack of higher sense of purpose. But to me, in my experiences, one of the things that I have found that is, one of its greatest things to gobble up, the adversary or the dragon's greatest things to gobble up, is this idea of narrative exclusivity or narrative exclusion. Because, I mean, think about it, right? If any story of any city was only told from the perspective of the dragon, then, it kind of doesn't sound that bad, right? Like, it kind of doesn't sound that bad if the story only comes from one perspective. Now, admittedly, most of us on this call or in this room did not invent the dragon, right? Like, nor did we invite the dragon in. We did not create the dragon in the first place. In fact, we were, born into or graduated into a land in which this dragon already existed. And I understand that. Like, I personally descend from a incredible enslaved woman, an enslaved Black woman from Owensboro, Kentucky. Her name is Charity. And as I see it, kind of looking at her story, there are just simply knowledge gaps in the historic record. And neither you nor I put them there, right? Like, there were millions of pages of letters, diaries, photographs, posters, cookbooks, newspapers, anything else imaginable, created by communities that were just simply not collected at the time that they were created, and have most likely been destroyed since. And so, we didn't create it, but this is where I would want to introduce this idea of presence and absence, and where these two ideas begin to hold weight. And what we can do about it, right? If there is something we can do about it, or is the reality just so stark that it's too daunting to even think about doing anything about it? Like, we kind of have to ask ourselves, like, is the dragon, like, actively attacking, or does it kind of always just, like, passively circle day after day, year after year? Well, the question to is it actively attacking, or at least one of the truths that I see, I speak for myself here, the archives and the archive profession, again, from my opinion, could continue to exist, and could continue to even succeed by certain metrics if we continued in the status quo, if we, kind of just, like, allowed this dragon to passively wander our streets. Yeah, like, the archives profession, believe it or not, I really think it could actually continue on its path. But, dare I suggest, or dare we imagine what our professional community, what our professional landscape, what the land of archivia land, whatever, could look like with a more diverse population. And that's not just necessarily with our collections, but that's in every part, in our profession, in our recruitment, in our retention, in our senior management. What if, right? Like, what if? So I know no one has actively said, like, hey, that's terrible, or hey, we're on board. But I imagine that if you're on this call, and if you are coming to the Q&A, then you are the kind of person that would love to have these conversations. So since we're here, I'm hoping that we could take a few minutes together to talk to you about some options that I personally believe open up if we all collectively decided to choose intentionality, right? Like, choosing to be intentional. So a little bit about myself before I kind of dive into answers to that. I graduated from library school in 2014, I think, which kind of, to be honest, feels like the Stone Age. I don't know if other people were, like, trained in archivist tool space, but it just seems like it doesn't matter. It just seems like such a long time ago. But, coming out of library school at the time, or actually before I went to library school, I participated, or I processed a blackface poster collection at the University of Kentucky. And then, I went to library school and I processed other artist collections at the Smithsonian Archives of American Art. And, even after graduating from library school, I continued to kind of specialize and more exclusively work in support of collections created by and for and about people of the Black diaspora. But even as a recent grad, I could see the holes in the historic record, like across the archives profession. And where there were Black collections, where these Black collections existed, they were either, a low priority or they were kind of tokenized. And in general, they just simply weren't there. And while the archives landscape has indeed improved, we still have what I would kind of refer to as these cultural hubs, right? Like they're repositories or even groups of repositories in specific geographic locations where, like, for example, if you wanted to research Black artists' collections, you go here. And if you need like Black politicians' collections, you go there. And very early on, this just simply wasn't something that I saw reflected in other communities. And on top of all of that, I learned also very quickly that if you were an everyday Black American family, more than likely, you just simply didn't even know that the archive, what it was, that it existed. And you typically didn't think to utilize this space for your family's story. And so what I saw were kind of two distinct problems around archives and this concept of intentionality, right? Like archives on this side, archives weren't intentionally going out and seeking to include voices of everyday Black folks in their repositories, right? And in general, only a small percentage of Black folks were intentionally going out and looking to preserve their stories in these traditional archives should they choose to do so. And so these two sides of the same coin, to me, these two intentional questions and in this idea drive me honestly so completely that I decided to dedicate a whole company dedicated to it. But that's what motivates me to face the dragon. I can only imagine what might motivate you. Like, maybe you are the archivist who is motivated by this really innate sense of social justice. But I know firsthand that can lead to burnout. And so let's talk about that. But also maybe you are the archivist who sees the beauty in diverse culture, in the diversity of cultures, and you seek to include those cultures in your repository, but you don't know where to look or how to ask or how to participate. Like maybe the other perspective, like maybe you're an administrator, but you are constantly faced with the very real responsibilities of making sure that everyone on your team, to the best of your ability, has a job to pay their rent, right? Like there are these very real perspectives. And unfortunately, I am not a genie. And despite how much I wish I could, there are just so many things in this world and about our profession that I cannot control. And here's the thing that I realized is that there are so many things in this world and about our profession that you can't control either, right? Like there is this multitude of internal and external forces that impact our work every day, day to day, that we have no control over. And so if there were only, two things that I hoped you would take away from this conversation, is that first, give yourself some grace. Like, you're doing great. 2, so that's 1. 2, we don't have to do all the things. We don't have to carry all the burdens. What we can do is choose to hold the pieces that we can and choose to do so consciously, intentionally, and with care. And what I mean by like archival ethics and intentionality really comes down to this idea around the construction of power. So, in my current work, in my current research, I'm looking at the how or the science of how history is made, history making as a practice, and how power is often ascribed to certain people or individuals or groups throughout history based on certain intentional choices. And, I've said this many times before, and I will continue to say it over and over and over again. History does not just happen. History is not random. It is not some random chronology of events or things that happened in a certain order. It is a specific and an intentional choice that creates power based on what is selected to be in and what is not, right? Like in my research, I'm trying to really look for this magic formula in which the construction of history is almost kind of used as like a currency or something, where there's this transaction that happens in which power is given or traded in exchange for something else. So what that looks like is kind of like those who can afford to buy what they need, i.e. a place in history, do so. And those who cannot afford or do not have access to or have been restricted from those same transactions are left out of the historic record. So all of that kind of comes to, if history is something that is curated and power is something that is constructed, then archivists, or those that kind of bolster certain powers by preserving certain histories, have the ability to be facilitators or waymakers rather than gatekeepers or passive participants. And so what if we all kind of took all of our LIS education and used that knowledge in the service of educating people on how to uplift their own stories and their own communities? In addition to things like appraisal and acquisition, what if we actually took the agency that we already have, that sometimes someone has allowed us to believe that we don't, canceling that. But what if we took the agency that we already had and went outside and actively used our position and our knowledge and our education and our positioning to help people leverage history making rather than simply being impacted or affected by it or being ignored by it in certain communities' cases, right? What if? All right, let me back down a little bit. Okay, so let's get back just really quickly to this story, right? Do you remember the dragon in the city from the beginning, right? And if you remember, we had this city full of wonderful people who are surrounded by this kind of sneaky dragon adversary that wasn't overtly attacking them, but was still present, right? And I asked you to think about what would you do, or at least I think I asked. If I didn't ask, I'm asking now. What would you do? And so as far as I see it, there are kind of three choices that you could do. First, you could run, you could flee the city, and that's fine, not knocking it. And two, you could defend the city. You could fortify the city and its walls and protect the citizens that are inside already, right? Or three, you could attack the dragon. Now you're wait a minute, Dominique. Wait a minute. No one said anything about attacking. Nothing. I am an archivist. I wear a cardigan, right? That is not what I came here to do. And I get it. I get it. But have you ever wondered, curiosity, have you ever wondered, dragons are usually protecting something of value. And I, for one, would dare to suggest that the power of history making and the power of narrative, the power of inclusion might actually be worth fighting for. So honestly, as archivists, armed with our mini Hollinger boxes off to battle some dragons, let me just assure you of the risks, because I think it's worth it. So let me break this up a little bit as we kind of talk through this next section, right? First, let me talk to my like pioneers in the room. So like pioneers are the earliest of the early birds. Like they are the people who are adventurous and typically have a pretty high tolerance for risk. Like y'all find excitement in new things and potential things left and right, right? Like you do admittedly have the a fear of the innovator tax, which is kind of like the cost of being the first person to take something on, but you're like totally cool with it. Like you acknowledge that it's there and you're ready to go on with it anyway. So examples of the pioneers in our profession could be like breakthroughs in the profession that people weren't necessarily ready to adopt right away, but you were like, yo, we're about to try this. Let's do it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't, right? Next, so like if this is a bell curve, like next I want to talk to like the early mainstream folk in the room, like early mainstream. Y'all tend to grab onto new ideas pretty early, but not quite as early as the pioneers, but that's okay. Like y'all are really open to new ideas. You're also aware of the pitfalls, right? Like in this conversation, you have very strong hopes and ideas around archivists taking more agency in the construction of power, and you have strong hopes that this is something that could potentially be done at all. But part of you is still hesitant about the personal or professional damage that could admittedly happen if you were to endorse something that flopped or sounded crazy, or no one believed you. Well, I don't know, believe me, right? Like no one who ever took an early stance and stood up for themselves and what they believed in the service of other people has ever regretted it. So again, if this was a bell curve, like you have the pioneers. Well, let me start on this side. You have the pioneers, you have the early mainstream folk, and then you have the later mainstream folk here. And again, this is not a bad thing, right? Like, let's break out of these ideas of categorization or like levels. This is not a bad thing. It is simply those who wish to buy into a more fully baked plan, theory, manual, whatever. And I know that in an ideal situation, this group would want the manual on archival agency and ethics to be like written and tested out in the marketplace, because I understand that you're very aware of the potential disruption that could occur in society, right? Like if all of a sudden hundreds of archivists started storming out into the streets and refused to process any more majority culture collections, like that would be a problem, right? Like I get it. Let me assure you though, one, that's not what this is. Two, you know, when I look around and I see the amount of intentional work that's already being done with a diversity of communities at a diversity of repositories, I feel like we're already on our way. There are so many case studies or examples of this work, of intentional work being done throughout our profession. So, you know, let's elevate those. And as no matter kind of where you are on the bell curve, this isn't easy work, right? Like I get it. It's not easy, but I think I've come up with three practical ways to move the needle. The first is to be intentional about what you choose to hold, kind of like what I said before. No one, in my opinion, no one can hold all the things and be all the things to all the people without something falling apart, or all of it falling apart. The way I was raised, you know, the way my grandparents taught me, like it's far better to be intentional about what part of this journey towards a more diverse historic record you can choose to hold and commit to doing those like one or two things extremely well. So like a practical example of this, or of what this could look like, is to say, you know, hey, I'm not agreeing to be on any more libraries 100th anniversary planning committees, because honestly right now I'm being very intentional about decolonializing the descriptive practices in the collections that I'm processing. You know, another example could be that, you know, to accept that while I see the glaring holes, right, like I solo cannot improve the diversity of multiple identities in my large repository during my single tenure alone in this position. What I can do is an example, I can be very intentional about building relationships with Black women artists of the 20th century and fostering a spirit in which they might feel comfortable donating their materials to any institution at some point, even if it isn't mine. 2, so that was 1. 2, let's be intentional. Let's be an intentional participant in history making. Like, if it doesn't matter, in my opinion, it doesn't matter if you're the dean of libraries or a contract processor. Like, we're all participating in the story of archive land, whether we believe it or not. Whether you believe you have all the power or no power, I can guarantee you that is true. So I'll say it again, right? Like, whether you believe you can or you cannot, your belief is your reality. So I highly recommend that you believe in yourself and you believe yourself to be equipped enough to steward change in this profession. Like, if we are agreed that history making is an active process that benefits some while oppressing others, then please believe to be involved in how your energy is stewarded towards the presence of more histories in that record. Right? 3rd, because we're coming to the end here. 3rd, be intentional about the roles and positions that you choose to take on in this work. And this is actually specifically, it's nuanced but different from the other point. Be mindful of the ways that you can leverage your position to provide greater access or increase discoverability or experiment with acquisition processes, like, for example, that include post-custodial care, right? Be intentional about the communities you choose to work in and work with. Like, you can decide that maybe not all is lost, but rather there might be more collections and stories out there in attics and basements that just simply look different than what our barcodes and manuscript boxes are used to. But, go outside. Literally, go outside. And, don't just assume that someone above you will go out instead and cultivate those relationships, or that community members will just call you up and volunteer. Like, for example, if there is a community event held at the local coffee shop, go and silently sit in the back, right? Listen. And when you feel the urge to chime in, just listen some more, right? And then leave. I know, right? Then leave and come back the next week or the next month and again sit in the back and listen. And time and time again, you will eventually learn the community and they will learn you. And building relationships with communities, again, in my opinion, and I'm particularly speaking from my experience as a Black woman working with communities across the Black diaspora, in my opinion, relationship building is rooted in time, talking, and togetherness. So just to break that down, you cannot build trust if you haven't spent honest time with one another without asking for something in return, right? You cannot build trust without talking to the other person and being more interested than interesting. And finally, you cannot build trust without togetherness, right? The more experiences you have working together towards a common goal, whether that be photographs for a local church anniversary program, or partnering with a social studies teacher at a high school, the more you do these things, the more of service you are, the more that trust gets built. So, right, all in all, whatever role you are in and whatever part you can play, please remember that history and history making is not random. Those we see present in the archive were placed there intentionally, and those we do not see were not included as a conscious and deliberate choice, right? Those who are not represented in the canonical archival record were left out of it by someone's choices. Honestly, it's as a tool of currency or power, but I'm still working on that. Power is often constructed one reference, one diary, one photograph at a time. And if the collection boxes that we're using simply can't fit all the stories that we could possibly collect, forget them. Boxes are for squares anyway. So I hope that this is interesting. I hope it was engaging. I hope that it sparks conversation, and I hope that you will join us in our live Q&A session following after this. Thank you very much.